Welcome to Imperial History, the podcast where we explore the epic stories of empires that shaped the world, from their triumphant rises to their dramatic falls. I'm your host, Eric Alexander. When we left off, the tide of the Umayyad invasion had, for the first time, been halted. Duke Odo of Aquitaine had struck the first meaningful blow against an army that had, until that moment, seemed unstoppable. And, in the rugged northern reaches of the Iberian Peninsula, a man named Pelagius, perhaps an unlikely hero, had done something few would have dared to imagine. He had defied the greatest power in the known world, and won. The battle at Covadonga in 718 was not a decisive engagement in the traditional sense. There was no cataclysmic clash between two massive armies. No open-field slaughter that saw tens of thousands cut down in a single day. Instead, it was something much more insidious, something that the Umayyad commanders would have immediately recognized as deeply problematic. It was a successful rebellion, a defiant flicker in the darkness, one that, unlike so many others, would not be snuffed out. The kingdom of Asturias, under Pelagius, had broken free from the Umayyad grip, and the first phase of what would later be called the Reconquista had begun. And yet, despite this defiance, the Umayyads made no real effort to retake Asturias. Why? Because, quite simply, it wasn't worth it. The economic rewards were minimal, the mountains were treacherous, and the logistical challenge of subduing this tiny corner of Iberia was simply too costly. But the Umayyads had bigger ambitions. They had set their eyes on a prize far more tantalizing, far more lucrative: the kingdom of the Franks. The Umayyads were not content with merely holding what they had already taken. They wanted more. They wanted to expand the reach of the Caliphate deep into the heart of Europe. And so the Caliphate turned its attention to Septimania, the last vestige of Visigothic rule north of the Pyrenees, a crumbling province clinging to its independence but standing as a tempting target for the forces of Islam. By 725, the Muslims had swept through Septimania, capturing city after city. The great walled fortress of Carcassonne fell. Nimes, too, yielded to the invaders. The power of the Umayyads now stretched deep into southern Gaul, an empire growing not just in territory, but in confidence. And yet, they didn't stop there. The campaign pressed forward, pushing into the kingdom of Burgundy. The great Frankish heartland was now under threat. By 725, Umayyad forces reached as far as Autun, a city deep in the east, far beyond what most Franks could have ever imagined. For a moment, it seemed as though the Muslims might continue northward, marching ever closer to the core of Frankish power. And if that had happened, if the Franks had fallen as the Visigoths had before them, well, history, as we know it, might have looked very different indeed. But then, almost as quickly as they had arrived, the Umayyads pulled back. The siege of Autun was brief, the occupation fleeting. They withdrew south, retreating from Burgundy, and the great march northward ground to a halt. Why? There are theories. Some say logistical challenges, that they had stretched their supply lines too thin, too quickly. Others argue that the resistance in Burgundy had been stronger than expected. Perhaps Anbasa simply calculated that holding this far-flung territory wasn't feasible, at least not yet. Whatever the case, the Umayyads abandoned Autun, consolidating their rule over Septimania. Pushing so far into Gaul, one must wonder, where are the Franks? Where is the great Frankish counterattack? Imagine a realm, one that was meant to be mighty, meant to be powerful. A land that was the very beating heart of Europe. It was meant to be a kingdom of emperors, of warlords, of unbreakable rulers, and yet it wasn't. This is the early medieval kingdom of the Franks, a land that, at least on parchment, was a single realm. But in reality, it was anything but unified. It was fractured, a collection of warring lords and rebellious dukes, each of them more interested in their own power than in the survival of the so-called kingdom. A kingdom that, on paper, should have been an indomitable force, but in practice was a tempting target. A target for enemies, both within and without. And in the middle of all this, a man. A man who would not be king, but who would be more powerful than any king before him. A man whose descendants would forge an empire out of the wreckage of chaos. Charles Martel. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with why the Frankish kingdom was in such a state to begin with. The Franks had been a dominant force in Europe since the fall of Rome. Under Clovis, their first great king, they had united much of Gaul under their rule. But Clovis had a problem, one that would haunt his kingdom for centuries: Frankish inheritance laws. You see, the Franks didn't follow primogeniture, the system where the eldest son gets everything. No, in Frankish law, every son of the ruler got a piece of the kingdom. And that might sound fair, except that it meant every generation saw the kingdom shattered into ever smaller pieces, ruled by rival brothers, cousins, and uncles, all clawing for dominance. And when one of them died, well, his sons divided his portion even further. What this meant was that while the Frankish kingdom had the potential to be a European superpower, it spent most of its time at war with itself. Kings weren't all-powerful rulers. They were, at best, the most dominant warlord in a realm full of warlords. And sometimes, not even that. Take Duke Odo of Aquitaine. Aquitaine was technically part of the Frankish kingdom, but in reality, Odo ruled it like an independent state. He had his own armies. He made his own decisions. He even fought against the Frankish king when it suited him. France, or more accurately, what would become France, wasn't a nation in any real sense. It was a battlefield, a land of noble factions locked in a struggle for power, a place where the title of king often meant very little. And if you're a foreign power looking at this mess, well, you might be thinking, this looks easy. But just when it seemed like the kingdom might fall apart completely, a new power began to rise. And that power didn't come from the throne. It came from the man who held real power, the mayor of the palace. Now, let's talk about the Merovingians. This was the ruling dynasty of the Franks, going all the way back to Clovis. But by the time, the early 700s, they were barely ruling at all. They had kings, sure, but these kings were more like ceremonial figureheads, puppets on a throne, while the real power lay elsewhere. And the person who really held power, that was the mayor of the palace. It's an interesting title. It sounds almost like a glorified butler, right? Like someone who organizes the king's household, makes sure the royal court runs smoothly. But in reality, the mayor of the palace was the true ruler of the Frankish lands. And by the time we get to Charles Martel, that position had transformed into something akin to a warlord, a ruler in all but name. And Charles, he wasn't just any warlord. He was a military genius, a hardened commander, and, maybe most importantly, a man who understood the game of power in a way few others did. Before Charles could even think about ruling, he had to win his kingdom. And that meant dealing with his rivals, both within and outside the realm. In 718, he faced off against the Neustrians and the Aquitanians, powerful factions within the Frankish world. The Neustrians weren't just some rebellious noble house. They were a serious rival, a faction that had its own power, its own ambitions, and its own dreams of ruling the Frankish lands. The two sides met at the Battle of Soissons, a clash that would decide who truly held the reins of power in the Frankish kingdom. Charles crushed the Neustrians, and Duke Odo took what remained of his forces and fled back to Aquitaine. And in doing so, Charles cemented himself as the de facto ruler of the Franks. He wasn't king, officially; that title still belonged to the Merovingians. But in practice, he was the one calling the shots. And now that he had control, Charles began his true work, shaping a realm that was actually capable of defending itself. He spent the next decade bringing rebellious nobles to heel, waging campaigns to centralize power and, most importantly, preparing for the storm he knew was coming. In 730, the Umayyads returned to Aquitaine. The duchy was still ruled by Duke Odo, a man of pride and ambition. Confident in his past victories, he chose to face the Muslim forces alone. To his credit, he had done it before, crushing the Umayyads at Toulouse in 721. He was, in fact, the first to ever defeat them in open battle. But this time was different. From the south came Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, a warrior, a governor, a strategist. He was not merely leading a raid, he was leading a conquest. His eyes were set on Aquitaine. At his command was an army 20,000 strong. In the days of Rome and Persia, such a force might have been unremarkable, but in this age it was a juggernaut. In 732, the two forces met at the river Garonne. The battle was a massacre. The Umayyad cavalry, swift and ruthless, tore through the Aquitanian lines like a hot blade through wax. The battlefield became a graveyard. Thousands fell, their cries swallowed by the chaos. The Garonne ran red with blood. Duke Odo, once the proud defender of his land, watched in horror as his army was cut to pieces. He fled. Only then did he grasp the truth. This was not a war he could win alone. Fortune, however, offered him a reprieve. Al-Ghafiqi's men, undisciplined in victory, lost precious time looting monasteries and ransacking the countryside. Seizing the moment, Odo did what had once been unthinkable. He turned to his old rival, Charles. For years, Odo had defied Charles's authority, asserting Aquitaine's independence. But politics, like war, is about survival. And Odo understood this. If he could not convince Charles to stand with him, there would soon be no Aquitaine left to rule. Charles agreed to assist Odo in return for Odo formally recognizing him as his overlord. After reorganizing his remaining forces, Odo joined Charles, and together they set out for battle. It was October 10th, 732. Two armies stood poised on a battlefield near the city of Tours. On one side, a battle-hardened Frankish force, and on the other, the Umayyad Caliphate's elite, an army forged in the fires of conquest. Before a single sword was drawn in earnest, Charles played the long game. He knew his enemy. He understood the power of the Umayyad cavalry, warriors who had ridden through the Iberian Peninsula like a scythe through wheat. A head-on clash in open terrain? That would have been suicide. Charles, ever the tactician, needed an edge. He chose his battlefield carefully, positioning his forces on high ground among thick forests and uneven terrain, places where cavalry charges would lose momentum, where the Franks' steadfast infantry, trained and hardened by years of warfare, could stand firm against the storm. For an entire week, both sides stared each other down, an eerie calm before the inevitable clash. Abdul Rahman, ever the strategist himself, held back, waiting for reinforcements, watching, calculating. But Martel had patience, an iron will forged through years of conflict. His forces stayed disciplined, their numbers obscured by the landscape. He was drawing the Umayyads into his web, and when the moment came, he would spring the trap. And then, after 7 days, the dam burst. Abdul Rahman, sensing that time was slipping through his fingers, unleashed his cavalry. The first wave hit like thunder. Horses and men slammed into the Frankish lines, expecting the usual result: panic, collapse, victory. But Martel's men held. The chaos was unimaginable. The sounds, the clash of iron, the desperate screams of men being trampled under hooves, the battle cries echoing across the hills, filled the air. Again and again, the Umayyad cavalry charged, their lances piercing flesh, their swords hacking at the Frankish shield wall. And yet, time and time again, the Franks, like a living fortress, absorbed the impact and refused to break. And then came the turning point, the moment where history pivoted on a knife's edge. Somewhere on that battlefield, a rumor took root among the Umayyad forces. It spread like wildfire. Their camp, the place where they had stored their plunder, their wealth, their very livelihood, was under attack. Maybe it was a group of Frankish raiders. Maybe it was just battlefield paranoia. We will never know for sure. But we do know what happened next. A portion of the Umayyad army peeled away from the fight, rushing to defend what they believed was under siege. The discipline that had held them together gone in an instant. And Martel, ever the opportunist, saw his opening. He ordered a counter-offensive. His men surged forward, pressing into the now weakened Umayyad ranks. And somewhere in that swirling maelstrom of steel and death, Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi fell. Leaderless, bleeding, and suddenly very aware that they were in a fight they could no longer win, the Umayyads began to retreat. Under the cover of darkness, they abandoned their camp, their supplies, their wounded. By dawn, the battlefield belonged to the Franks. The battle resulted in the deaths of 12,000 Umayyads, while only 1,000 Franks perished. The morning after was eerie. The Frankish forces, expecting another attack, found only silence. The Umayyads were gone, slipping south, back across the Pyrenees, back to the lands they had conquered so effortlessly before. But their advance into the heart of Europe stopped cold. In the years that followed, Martel became a legend. The man who had held the line, the man who had turned back the tide. They called him the Hammer, a name as fitting as any in military history. Would the Umayyads have eventually pushed further into Europe if they had won that day? Would the world we know today be entirely different? Historians still debate the importance of the Battle of Tours. Was it truly the battle that saved Christendom? Or was it merely one clash in a much longer struggle? The answer may depend on perspective. But one thing is certain. After Tours, the Umayyads would never again push so deeply into Western Europe. And on that October day, in 732, in a battle that could have tipped the balance of civilization, Charles Martel and his Franks stood their ground.